Okay, shall we get started?
Yeah,
Um, yeah, maybe let's quickly discuss the topic from last time because I guess you emailed me earlier today, Adam, about something you'd seen to do with stable diffusion. It's interesting how quickly that topic has moved, even in the last week. I don't know if you had any
yeah,
further thoughts on that.
yeah. Well, I've seen in the news and in various chat forums and the the places where I normally just go to watch conversation as part of my morning news feed. I spend about 30 minutes doing that sort of stuff, and I check out on places like Slashdot and certain subreddits and a few other forums and just because it's useful to see headlines, and then it's also useful to spend a few minutes seeing the chatter and the response to the headlines. I find that instructive because it gives me a sense, you sort of put your finger on the pulse of things that way. I never participate, but the sometimes it's interesting to watch the conversations. And one thing that I've definitely seen over the last couple of weeks is a major uptick in precisely what we've been talking about for a bit longer than that now, which is uh, automation of creative tasks, and in particular with the examples of art. You know, there's suddenly a surge of concern about, okay, well, what's going to happen to these jobs, these occupations, these professions, illustrators and artists and graphic designers and related work. And then I've seen a lot of back and forth, a lot of debate. Oh, you can't ever really replace the artist, and well, it's as much about expression as it is about the audience's perception. Those are, anyway, we talked a little bit about this. And then of course I came across a fascinating example today, which is in the news, and it's controversial because there's an ethical dimension to it, which is a fellow submitted a piece of work generated by Midjourney, which I don't know which model that is or what it's based on, but it's some model, it's some system that's similar to Dolly or of that ilk. And the person who was using that model as an artist himself, and he fine-tuned the prompt into the system. So he played around and was quite careful with this. But then the piece of work that was produced by the model, he submitted to a competition, an art competition, and he won. And so and he was very vague. He didn't fully disclose that this was generated by or with the use of AI. Now, it was a digital art competition, and he did say it was produced using Midjourney, but it seems that the organizers didn't understand that what this really was. They didn't know what they were dealing with. And so the backlash is that, well, is this ethical? It was deceptive. It was cheating. There were a lot of analogies like this is this is somebody like entering a weightlifting competition and they're using a forklift, and so they're cheating by using this tool. Then,
get in the. We're in the human division with the poor art.
right. But I mean, but all of this stuff is so incredibly revealing, which is that in these other competitions, and part of it is what's interesting is that this is not just casual consumption. This is a competition, and there's but strange competition in that there's no absolute measure. It's just up to judges, right? Because it's art. And so unlike a weightlifting competition where you can just see how much weight comes off the mat, the in this case the judges were fooled. And if professional art judges and quote unquote experts can be fooled into fooled as in they can judge the quality of a piece of art to be superlative, having been produced by a machine. Well, I mean, that's a pretty definitive slam dunk in terms of the audience side of the equation, right? I mean, if you've got people who are expert judges and either self-appointed or appointed by their peers, and they can't make the determination that this art that's been produced is low quality because of its mode of production, well, then I think that's fairly definitive evidence, very hard to, pretty unequivocal evidence, pretty hard to contest, that any normal consumer would be, would be in the same situation, would be bamboozled in the same sort of way, as it were. In other words, they would, if they didn't know who or how the art was produced by, then it would just be a matter of judging it on its own merits, and it's on its own merits, it's fantastic. So I think it's kind of case closed on that side of things. Now, where it's still open is, where's the value if you know who the artist is, and if you know how it was produced, and if you know what it meant to the producer, and so on and so forth, and that's all fine. But this is quite an extraordinary development. And again, the thing that you mentioned in your email replying to me, Dan, was that, holy moly, this is all happening just at an absolutely breakneck pace, right? These developments are coming just fast and furious. This is not something that's evolving over years, but just literally in weeks. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, there was another aspect of this sort of saga that I think is worth highlighting and touches on the AI safety topic, which is, so the first kind of, OpenAI got a lot of publicity for the original DALL-E, and then planning to release it, and then releasing it. And the first wave I saw of images that people were posting on Twitter were from the DALL-E, the early beta, I guess. But very quickly, people replicated that and released it as, I wouldn't call it open source exactly, but they openly released it. And that has been incorporated into many tools, and people are running it on their own machines. And it has slightly different capabilities to DALL-E, and I guess I will continue to use DALL-E, especially since it added this outpainting thing as a built-in feature now, as of like this morning. But the thing there is that OpenAI couldn't really even monopolize this capability it was on the order of weeks, right? So the idea that any of these capabilities will be effectively be able to be gatekept, for better or worse, right? I mean, you could imagine situations in which you don't want to have these disruptions take place in an uncontrolled fashion, but it's I think they estimated the training cost was about $600,000 or something for the Stability Diffusion model, and that was paid by, I think, one guy, right? So whoever, one of the principal developers there, I don't know the exact story. If someone does, please fill me in. But my impression was that there's some, relatively wealthy individual who just footed the bill for replicating DALL-E and then released it. And as the technology improves, the bang you can get for that much buck, for roughly $1 million, is going to keep notching upwards, right? So it's well within the capabilities of many wealthy individuals to just be like, yeah, I think everybody should have this. And then, a month later, with sufficient engineering talent, there it is, and you release it. So we really should...
Well, and certainly that amount of money for a government inclined to do that, or an organization like a philanthropically funded organization, its mission was to do that. You can see that it would be quite feasible. And I can imagine crowdsourcing it both financially. Crowdsourcing $1 million is not beyond the realm of possibility for something that's very desirable, the functionality of service that's desirable. So I can see crowdsourcing it as an option purely financially. And then with something like training, AI training, as opposed to perhaps other, crowdsourcing efforts, I can imagine it being crowdsourced just in terms of compute as well, in the style of the SETI at home, protein folding, those other sort of crowd computing applications. You can imagine the training being done on a network like that, perhaps a bit slower, but with people contributing compute instead of dollars. So yeah, I agree with something like AI training. I honestly don't see, unless the method is really carefully safeguarded and secreted, I don't see how this can be gatekept.
Yes, that's worth keeping in mind for a lot of these topics we're going to discuss.
And maybe this is worth asking you guys. I guess I hadn't really ever thought about this explicitly before, but there's a phenomenon in sports where things can seem impossible, and then finally, once one person achieves the feat and proves that it's possible, very quickly afterwards, other people replicate it. So you see this there are a lot of sports where this happens, gymnastics and and skateboarding and all lots of acrobatic style sports and things like that, where something that's been an elusive goal, if it's finally achieved, and then suddenly there's a sort of a breakthrough, and a number of other people follow. And I don't know if it's the same with technology. It's an interesting question, but it's almost like you don't even necessarily need to see exactly how something is achieved. You simply need to have the existence proof, and then
you probably need to be within
replication can end up following fairly quickly, right?
Yeah, if you're within some distance of the frontier, I think that's true.
Right.
Yeah, I listened to an interview with Jan McCoon, famous deep learning researcher, and until recently head of the sort of independent research entity inside Facebook doing deep learning. So Facebook has a bit of an inferiority complex vis-a-vis DeepMind. So I think the interviewer was talking about something DeepMind did, and who do you think will be the first to AGI or whatever? And Jan's point was exactly what you just said. He said, well, whoever gets there first or to any given capability, we're all kind of within some epsilon of each other. So if one person gets there and we just know it's possible, then probably we'll be able to figure out how they did it, or we'll just make the effort and get it done. And that's happened several times over the last decade. So yeah, absolutely. Shall we move on to my proposed topic for today?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so we talked about the relationship between art and society and art and individuals last time, and the impact that AI is not going to have, the impact it's having, like as we have this conversation out there in the world. One that's not quite here yet, but is very soon going to be here, is the disruption of connections between humans. And I'll relate a few anecdotes regarding my own relationship, so to speak, with GPT-3, and then try and make an argument by analogy with the way we sometimes find friends in books. And then I'll open the floor to discuss the positive and negatives about feeling that you're in relationship to an algorithm in this way. Okay, so since I've had GPT-3, which is probably a month or two, I often find myself, when I'm stuck creatively, just kind of typing stuff into it. A good example was last weekend we were having a game jam where Billy was part of the group there. We were making a game in 24 hours. You should try it at some point, Adam. I'll send you a link. We weren't quite sure what mechanic we wanted to use, so I typed some random stuff into GPT-3 and saw what it said. What's a game jam? Yeah, Game Jam, it's to do with the Roblox Developer Conference. Every year they have a competition where you have to make a game in 24 hours. So jam by analogy to a band jamming, I guess, right? You just try and come up with something in a short period of time, which was a lot of fun. So it wasn't actually that helpful in the end, but I've done this several times, and I know my son quite enjoys it, right? So he quite enjoys typing random stuff into GPT-3 when I'm sitting there and kind of seeing what it talks about. And it knows a lot of stuff, right? In some ways it knows more than me, way more than me. It's memorized an incredible amount of knowledge. So it's kind of fun, It's a bit loopy and not always useful, but it's fun. And I found it even interesting and useful, like in my real work. So I was prompting it with some questions about, connections between logic and geometry, and it was coming up with, most of the time boring, banal bullshit, or it just didn't answer. But a couple of times it came up with things that I think it must have been drawing from a paper I hadn't read, and so I went and looked for it, and I could kind of find what it was talking about, but it was actually interesting and true, and kind of prompted me to think for quite a while about what it was. I'm reading too much into it. It probably doesn't understand what it's talking about, but nonetheless, this is an actual experience I had. Okay, so that's the current state of things. Now, once this gets to a point, which is very soon going to be here, where you can attach a voice on either end, right? You take your speech, it's translated into text for the model, and then the model speaks back to you. And it has a much longer memory and can incorporate that into its statements, which are things people are already working on. There's like 20 startups out there doing this right now. We'll you know, we'll just have conversations with these things and find them partly useful, partly not, but increasingly useful. And they will have a lot of context about the kind of questions we've asked them, the things we're interested in, and so on. Okay, is that a friend? I mean, I don't really want to get into a debate about that, but it's certainly an entity you're interacting with in a way that means something to you, in the sense that it changes the nature of your thoughts, pushes you in directions you may not have gone otherwise, etc. Exactly as these art algorithms are doing. And I want to contrast that. I mean, you could look at that and say, that's just so unnatural, right? Terrible. You should have relationships only with human beings. And if you're an extroverted person, maybe that's seems like a good argument. But my retort to that would be, I feel like most of my friends are dead, right? They're people in books. And that's not an unusual feeling for a kind of nerdy, bookwormy, intellectual person. I've had, immense changes to my personality and way of looking at the world from just interacting with the thoughts of people who wrote them down. I named my son Russell after Bertrand Russell because I'm deeply influenced by his work. I'm deeply influenced by Nietzsche, like many people, and on and on and on, right? And I think about those words when I'm facing things that I'm not sure what to do about. In the same way you might have a conversation with a friend, which I also do, but so they're very active presences for me. And often people refer to, people whose books have had a deep impact on them as feeling like friends. So is it really that different to let the words of dead people into your soul? Is it so different from letting something like GPT-3 have an impact on you? So that's the question I'd like to pose. Anybody want to pick that up?
Well, can I add a couple of things to that before we before going going into answering mode, just kind of adding to the context of this. I've heard the term one-way friendships to describe, when you have an author you particularly like, and they can be living or author is no longer living, author from the past, from history from the past. But I've heard that term, and it's kind of a fun one, having a one-way friendship or a one-way relationship with somebody. I agree. I think that's really quite common. Two other things. One, on this idea of speaking to a something like GPT-3 or certainly this subsequent the next generation, maybe 2 or 3 generations ahead. It's easy to imagine a situation where it feels like you're speaking to a computer from science fiction, the kinds that were depicted in the science fiction of my youth. So I'm thinking, the computer of the Enterprise in Star Trek, for example, which the show went to some length to say was not sentient, but could certainly, you could engage with it in a useful conversation. And what's interesting is that the plots of Star Trek episodes, in particular the Next Generation, not the original series, which had a very primitive view of computers, which I think we exceeded pretty quickly. But the view of in the Star Trek: The Next Generation, which was made in the 80s and 90s, of what computers were, was that they would not be sentient, but they would be, things you could converse with, fluid voice synthesis and all of that kind of stuff, understand your questions and so on. But not fully sentient. Commander Data was a machine, an extraordinary machine, the only one around that was fully sentient. But the main computer of the Starship Enterprise was like, I think what Google's and Siri and that sort of personal assistant style interface that we were aiming for. That was what was realized in the as a conceit of the in-show universe, right? And one thing that I think is fascinating and perhaps very insightful, considering it was 35 years ago, almost 40 years ago, or no, more than that now, is that a lot of the plots had some element of using the computer to prompt for problem solving. So the holodeck was a place where the officers of the Star Trek officers would go in, and they would, if they were interacting with the computer, they could do so either just with this voice, this disembodied voice, and ask it for ideas and suggestions, and to make extrapolations and so forth based on some information that they had. So they were using it as a thinking aid, as a thinking tool, even though it wasn't sentient. And then to take it a step further, on the holodeck, the computer was creating fictional characters, and there are a lot of instances like that. Some for entertainment in the style of sort of Westworld, and then also other ones where I can vividly remember an episode where some character, I don't remember which character, had the computer recreate Einstein and maybe
it was Barclay.
Stephen Hawking or Isaac Newton or something. Was that Barclay? Okay, it was Barclay. And so the computer made a recreation of a fictional character, and Lieutenant Barclay was interacting with this character. And so that is kind of literally what you're talking about, Dan, where the AI brought very much to life a figure from history, and allowed the human being to interact with that. I'm trying to avoid using words like person and so forth, but to interact with that persona or I don't know, phantasmagorical kind of simulacrum. And it's this. So anyway, this is sounding very much like where we might be headed, and anticipated by many decades. So it's quite prescient, perhaps, if this does come to pass. So that was one of the first things that occurs to me, is that there is at least some interesting precedent for this in familiar science fiction, and then of course in deep, in more esoteric science fiction, there's pretty much everything's been covered.
Yeah, you just reminded me that there's several episodes about Barclay's holodeck addiction, which is a very interesting note, where he was socially awkward in the real world, so to speak, and found it much more comfortable to be around virtual characters who he could design, and he just didn't want to leave the holodeck because he found it just more comfortable there. And this was viewed as, actually was treated very sensitively, I think, and in a quite sophisticated way, as many Next Generation episodes were. Yeah, if anybody hasn't seen that, I would highly recommend it. I think it would still hold up. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't seen that in many years, but I imagine parts of it would probably hold up quite well, and it would be interesting to see where it didn't. And sorry, one other additional thought for context, on a personal note. One rule in my house that applies to my kids is they have to treat. We have a Google speaker. When it's like Amazon's Alexa or Siri or whatever. We have the speaker system in the house, and you can just talk to it, and you access Google's personal assistant. Very easy. It's the typical, okay, Google, and then you can ask what the weather's going to be, or and it can do all kinds of things. It'll search the internet. It'll read you Wikipedia articles. It'll cover the news. It'll do math problems for you, and all kinds of stuff. So it's already fairly sophisticated, and it's not conversational. It's not it's laggy enough and kludgy enough that it doesn't quite feel, like it's like you're interacting with, like you're interacting with a person at all yet. It's not there yet. Nevertheless, in my house, the rule is you treat Google like a person. And so my kids follow this with all good manners and please and thank you and all of that stuff. So that's what we do in my house, is we treat the AI as if it is a person. And the entire reason for that is that this is an important habit to have, because it is going to be a person before too long, or close enough that it doesn't matter.
And if you're rude, then in 50 years, when the AIs review all the logs, they'll see that you were rude, and they'll come and get you. That's the basilisk, right? Rocco's basilisk.
We don't want Rocco's basilisk. Right? That's right. So yeah,
Billy's in trouble.
So yeah, let's not talk about that. So, but anyway, yeah, this is I think outside of a conversation like this one, this would seem utterly preposterous, I think, to most people right now. But maybe it's a bit like talking about how, what would you do if you could have a handheld device that you could access the internet on? So if you were talking about that in 10 years before the iPhone launched, it might seem a bit fantastical as well. So, yeah. Anyway, so back to your question and possible answers to the question, Dan.
Yeah, does anybody have anything they want to offer on that? Don't feel obliged to. I guess there's a few pros and cons that come to mind. Yeah, maybe I'll. I mean, one that I saw. I saw on Twitter somebody's startup, which was building AI friends, and then every so often they'll just drop an ad into their interactions with you, which is going to be a big thing, right? There's a huge business model for your best friend being an AI who just really happens to like Coca-Cola. It's like, hey, have you have you had a Coca-Cola today?
that's, that's god awful terrible. I hadn't thought of it, but
it's totally happening. That's what that's Disney's business model in 10 years, right? That's like where they'll make their trillions. It's basically how it works already with children's television, right? It's just like a continuation. So what's the general phenomena here? It's that when you make friends with a human, maybe they're also out to cheat you, right? Maybe, they're a beautiful woman and you're a dowdy guy and they're just trying to take advantage of you and steal your money, or the reverse configuration. Or they just want something from you, right? Because you can do something for them, so they're kind of being nice to you, but they're not really interested in having a true friendship, etc., etc. We're all sort of familiar with these scenarios. That's kind of the pain of growing up, is encountering these things for the first time, partly, right? But we sort of have some intuition about the bounds of that, right? Because there are very few like real spies out there, people who are completely faking a human interaction in order to manipulate you, and there's just no genuine friendship behind that veneer at all. That's relatively rare. But that kind of expectation about the relative proportion of these deceptive interactions is just not applicable to large-scale AI interactions. It could be that every AI system you interact with, if you're in Facebook's metaverse, say, is tracking you and out to get you in some fashion, or at least out to manipulate you. So that seems to me like a serious obstacle to valuing relationships with AI entities. Is you don't know what they're doing. You don't know how they're configured. You don't have the same range of ability to understand. How do you sound out a person? Well, you know a bit about their background, you interact with them for a long time, and people's ability to fake stuff is pretty limited unless they're psychopaths or well trained. So if you have a sort of functioning set of basic emotional IQ, you can sort of suss out who's genuine pretty quickly, usually. But those intuitions just won't operate for AI entities. So I think people could be very easily misled by their intuitions into trusting systems they shouldn't trust. And that's a big reason to be skeptical, I think, of valuing these interactions, because it's very unlikely you'll have a copy of GPT-6 that is on your desktop, right? That's not how things are going to shake out, probably. Or that you really understand how it was trained or trained on what. Maybe that's an important thing to pursue, but that doesn't how it's looking to go. So that's a definite downside.
I'm not normally cynical, but I'm not normally the most cynical person in the room. But just to be put on my cynical hat a little bit here, I think it might actually be worse than that, Dan, because not only do you take cable news media in America as the example, but any information bubble will do. But just cable news in the U.S. being a painfully operative example. So Fox News for conservatives and Republican Party in the U.S., and something like MSNBC or perhaps CNN for for liberals and the Democratic Party in the United States. Those information, media machines, they I think there are two kinds of viewers. There are more than two kinds, but two distinct kinds certainly that come to my mind. There are people who watch Fox News and think it's true, think it's the truth, and are genuinely fooled. They're genuinely, hoodwinked by the theatrics that pass as informative, substantive content. And I'm sure the same is true on the political left. You can debate on which one is, where it's more egregious, where people are being, duped more. But just to be more cynical about it, I think there's also a very large group of people who are well aware that they're in an information bubble, and that a lot of what they're viewing and being fed is crap, but they don't care. They're there because they like it. And so I think there are some people who are genuinely just bozos and are fooled by stuff. And I think there's a disturbingly large number of people who go on there because it's just for the gratification
that's to do with tribal. It's to do with a tribal orientation, right? I don't see how that exactly maps onto the interaction with AI agents.
I suppose if you had an AI that you were interacting with on a personal basis, it could be much more nuanced than simple tribalism. But you could imagine.
Oh, you have the Tucker Carlson friend.
If my conservative uncle had an AI buddy, it would definitely be somebody like Tucker Carlson, and he wouldn't choose the completely honest and unbiased and maximally objective and wise, AI. He would choose the Tucker Carlson conservative asshole AI, knowing full well that there were other options available. He would still choose that one. Just again, I'm being cynical about it, but
I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, right? That makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm.
And then of course it's going to be like Tucker Carlson, but super intelligent. So someone who's very difficult who's going to have just the best, arguments for that. Because you can imagine, it's going to be formidable to deal with.
Yeah, Billy just said in the chat, "Say what I believe, but make it sound smart." Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, maybe let's cover a pro in order to not end on this terrifying note of a million copies of Tucker Carlson whispering in everybody's ear. I think it's easy to see downsides of AI, especially because many of us enjoy pretty successful, comfortable lives. I don't know all of you, but at least those who I do know are relatively privileged, at least quite intelligent and able to make their way out of trouble usually. But if you just look at the statistics for the number of people who are living alone, especially older people, that's a large part of Tucker Carlson's audience, as I understand it, right? There's terrible epidemics of loneliness.
That's the Fox News business model. Is they terrify elderly people who are lonely. They lock them in with fear. That's the business model.
And you can see really depressing graphs of the amount of time per week people spend with different categories of people, right? With their children, with their parents, with friends, with co-workers. And you just see, on the x-axis of the graph is your age, and everything just trends down until, most people at some point, once their spouse dies or they get divorced, they're just pretty lonely most of the time. And it's okay, people make their way and, life goes on. Life's not meant to be, life, you don't expect it to necessarily be roses and easy all the time. But there is a huge need out there for companionship, and a lot of people find that in art or reading or movies or television that is interacting with culture. But a lot of people don't find that. And you could imagine that one of the ways in which AI will be transformative is just filling in a lot of that and helping people to connect to the history of human creativity and also to other people, perhaps. Um, so it's easy to be a bit cynical about the role of AI friends because well, I've got my friends. It's kind of for losers to want AI friends, but I think that's really judgmental somehow. I think it could be a very positive thing for many people, and many people are choosing to do that already, even with the very poor systems we have today, which indicates the deep need that's out there. And it doesn't have to be, it's tempting to use it as a marker for low status, as we do with a lot of things. Um, but I think that's really missing the potential for increasing human well-being, which is what we want AI to do. And one of the ways it can increase human well-being is make people less lonely and feel more connected. Maybe not to a living human, but if GPT-3 is kind of like, it's our best attempt to shove a huge amount of human output into a few billion parameters, right? It is human in some sense. At least it reflects humanity. And to connect with that as a lonely person is not a sad thing necessarily, at least in my opinion. Of course, yeah, it may all be Tucker Carlson's all the way down.
Well, I mean, I think well, I'm trying to think how to phrase this. Yeah, I think it's difficult to, let's see. Well, let me start with the loneliness and the social isolation portion of things. I think it is difficult to separate the 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 economic and the physical circumstances of loneliness from the sort of purely psychological and then perhaps social elements of it. And so I guess what I mean by that is that a lot of people, especially I'm thinking again of the sort of the demographic that you described, Dan, so people who are older and people who are retired or who are
Sorry, Adam. I made the current location a bit untenable, so we're going to have to move. My mistake. Oh. Follow me over the hill. So we probably want to disconnect from the...
Did I disconnect correctly?
Yeah, that's all good. Okay, yeah, please go on.
Okay, so sorry, I wasn't articulating myself very well. So take an example, and take an elderly person who's recently, say it's sort of imagine a worst case scenario. Somebody's elderly, so they're physically unwell. They're suffering from the insults of old age, and their spouse has died, so their long-term relationship that they were dependent upon is gone. And say they're a retiree, so they're no longer making income, through a job, but that they're struggling financially because they're not set up well for retirement, and the social safety net today does not provide well for retirees, unless they've put a lot of money away personally as privately as well. Okay, so someone's in a really difficult spot, but their loneliness is at least partly due to all of those factors together, right? It's not just a product of their psychology or their the social dynamics in their own lives. It's also a function of they lack economic prosperity, so they can't put themselves out there and seek out new relationships and fulfillment from them, and just physically, if you're elderly and you're effectively disabled physically, it can be extremely difficult, completely intimidating. The prospect of going out and socializing if you're physically unwell, and okay, so all of those things are realities, absolutely. These are all factors, but they're all things that are going to be in motion on a sort of similar time scale to this, the AI technology that we're talking about. So if you were to fast forward 20 years, we may be in a very different sort of situation economically. There may be a great deal more prosperity if my team's research is correct. So some of that economic pressure will hopefully be alleviated, and we may be starting to see 20 years from now, we may be starting to see some real progress in. I mentioned longevity when we first started today. I was looking at stuff about that earlier. So that's on my mind, and so it could be that people will be less vulnerable to loneliness just in general, and I think that it's really interesting because the right now the vulnerability to loneliness makes people a target for predation by the Fox News's enterprises of the world and the Tucker Carlsons of the world. But if people weren't so vulnerable to that, one could imagine relationships with artificial intelligence being extremely healthy and extremely positive. So I think I'm even more hopeful, Dan, than the picture you present, which is that not only are the factors that make people vulnerable today, not only are people in that situation likely to benefit a great deal from a personal relationship with artificial intelligence, I think that as people become less vulnerable because our prosperity increases in so many different dimensions, I think if anything, that will make any engagement they do have with artificial intelligence healthier. So I see it as largely a good thing, with some potential pitfalls there. Admitting the Tucker Carlson pitfall. I see it. I'm overwhelmingly positive about that prospect. And again, I know we evoked Star Trek before, but other science fiction has done a great job with some of these things. The movie Her, I think, is an interesting take on it. And because this is, it's about a young guy, and he's not poor, and he's not a retiree, and he's not unhealthy, but he's lonely. And it's quite a provocative film, because it really does engage with the question of what would a relationship with a super intelligence be like. Anyway, it's really neat.
Yeah, cool. I think we'll have to end it there. We're out of time, but that was fun. We can pick it up next week. Thanks, Adam.
Yeah, let's carry on. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Enjoy the rainstorm of whatever these guitar twanging things are.
See if you can survive on the way back to the starting point.